Thank you, Dr. Wyatt, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming to my science cafe. So my name is Catherine Early, and I'm in the 4th year of my PhD in Dr. Larry Whitmer's lab here at Ohio University. And for my dissertation research, I'm studying avian brain evolution. So I'm really excited to be here today to discuss this with you. And I do really want this to be a discussion, so if you guys have questions at any time, please just raise your hand and I'll try to get to them as I can. So to quickly go over what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to walk you through the evolution of birds and why they're so cool. We're going to talk about bird brains and what we know about how they work. We're also going to talk about studying past life, looking at the fossil record and comparing it to the life that we see around us today. And then I'll finish up with some of my own research on the brains and behaviors of birds that are no longer with us. But before I start, I want to take a quick poll. So with a show of hands, who came here today to learn about birds? Yay! Who came here to learn about dinosaurs? And who knows why that was a trick question? All right, do you want to give a guess? No, all right. Do you want to give a guess?
Yes, birds are actually the last lineage of theropodian dinosaurs.
Wow, okay, so he said it. The answer is that was a trick question because birds are actually the last living lineage of theropodian dinosaurs, to quote him exactly. Good job. And so most dinosaurs went extinct right around here at the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction. And that was a catastrophic extinction event in Earth's history where about 75% of the species alive at the time went extinct. But a few groups of dinosaurs made it through, and eventually, after millions of years, evolution became what we know today as birds. So birds are one of the most diverse and largest groups of vertebrate animals. So vertebrate animals are animals like you and I that have a backbone alive today because they have about almost 10,000 species that we know of alive today. But wait a minute, you might say, how do we know that birds are dinosaurs? Well, when scientists want to figure out how related different organisms are, they compare the different characteristics. And the organisms that share the most characteristics and don't share those characteristics with other groups of organisms are most related. So I'm going to walk us through a quick example with some very basic organisms here. We're going to have a triangle, a square, and a rectangle. And so you guys can look at these and see that they're all generally similar in that they all have multiple sides. And so you can group them that way. But if you look in more detail, you'll see that some of the organisms, such as the square and the rectangle, actually have more characteristics than just multiple sides that unite them. So for example, the square and the rectangle both have 4 sides and 90-degree angles, and the triangle does not. So in our example, this will mean that the square and the rectangle organism are more closely related to each other than they are to the triangle. And scientists can show this with evolutionary trees or cladograms, where the organisms that are more closely related are also more closely connected on the tree, as you can see here with the square and the rectangle. And so scientists have looked at birds and dinosaurs and compared a lot of the characteristics. There's, sometimes you would look at anatomy or developmental or behavioral characteristics, and based on the evidence that they've seen, birds are dinosaurs. In fact, they're theropodian dinosaurs, as our friend over there said. So now that we know how to read these evolutionary trees, we can see that crocodilians, so things like alligators, are the closest living relative to dinosaurs, and birds are actually just another theropod dinosaur. I'm going to take a break to do another poll. Who knows what some other types of theropod dinosaurs are? So these are the classically bipedal, so they walk on 2 legs, meat-eating dinosaurs. Any guesses? There's a pretty big one right here. What is it? Tyrannosaurus Rex? Okay, so that is a theropod dinosaur. So that's in the group of dinosaurs that birds are in as well. Does anyone else know any other theropod dinosaurs? Yeah. T-Rex, yeah, and so maybe there's some others like Allosaurus? Anyone? Yeah? Brontosaurus is actually not a theropod dinosaur. It belongs over here with the sauropods, but it is still a dinosaur. Let's have one more name. Yeah, all the way in the back. Oh, are you thinking like Parasaurolophus, like these guys here? Okay, so those are also dinosaurs, but not theropod dinosaurs. So some examples of theropod dinosaurs would be, like we said, Tyrannosaurus rex, Allosaurus, and things like that. And if we zoom in to that part of the tree, the theropod part of the tree, now that we know how to read evolutionary trees, we can see that Tyrannosaurus rex is actually more closely related to the cardinal at your bird feeder than it is to this Allosaurus, this other theropod dinosaur. So since birds are the last living dinosaurs, they give a great window into studying extinct dinosaurs. But they're also really cool in their own right and deserve studying for various reasons. There were some groups of birds that actually went extinct when the dinosaurs went extinct, and some of them are illustrated over here. And a lot of their fossils get really beautifully preserved in ways that we didn't think were possible before. So on this fossil of Confuciusornis, we actually start to see outlines of soft tissues. And so that's challenged the way we think about how evidence of past life is preserved. There were also groups of birds that evolved after the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, but then went extinct later on, such as the guys up at the top, Pelagornis, Presbyornis, and Karuku, which went extinct before humans were around due to natural changes in the environment. But then we also have things like the Carolina parakeet, the moa, and the dodo that went extinct due to interactions with humans. And those are really interesting to us now because we're currently in a major extinction crisis. And so understanding how natural extinctions and human-caused extinctions happen will hopefully help us prevent losing the biodiversity of the Earth at the rate we're seeing currently. And then a few groups of birds survived past that time and have diversified into the amazing number of species that we see and the amazing different aspects of biology that we see in birds. For example, birds employ various reproductive strategies. So you have over here baby birds like songbirds, which are what we call altricial. That means that they need a lot of care from their parents for a long time while they're growing. Or you can have birds like ducks, like this wood duck, for example, that hatched probably 1 or 2 days before this photo was taken, and then is expected to jump out of a tree, out of a nest box, land in the water, and follow its parent around. So they are very different in some of the reproductive strategies they employ. They also engage in these really interesting display behaviors, using their feathers and moving their bodies in different ways to communicate to individuals of the same species, for example, mates or rivals, or sometimes even to individuals of other species. And tied to this display is another example, sexual dimorphism. So that's a classic kind of biology textbook example of evolution in action. And you can see that the peahen, so the female of this species, looks really different from the male of this species, which also engages in display behaviors to attract the females. Birds are also diverse in the types of locomotion they use. So for example, we have a penguin who can't fly in the traditional sense through the air, but is basically flying through the water as it swims. Hummingbirds, which can hover, and so they're beating their wings so fast that they can kind of stay still in the air. You have ostriches that can't fly at all, but they can run at really high speeds. Or you have things like vultures, which we should be very familiar with around here as they glide around. They're also very different in size sometimes. So the smallest is a bee hummingbird, which you can see on the top of this number 2 pencil. And the largest is an ostrich, largest alive today, I should say, is an ostrich that can support the weight of a human. Their diets are also very diverse, as you can see illustrated here. A lot of times birds are specialized to eat very specific things, and their anatomy kind of reflects that. And that extends not just to the anatomy of the beaks that you can see here, but sometimes also to the neuroanatomy, which means the anatomy that helps them navigate sensory information coming in and their brains. And so going off of that, we've talked about some aspects of diversity of birds that are really driven by behavior. But what drives behavior in all vertebrate animals is the brain, which you can see represented by this 3D model that's been blown up from the cattle egret so you can see it better. So in vertebrate animals, behavior is controlled by the brain. You can study behavior on its own, but if you want to understand what's causing it, you need to get back to the central processing system that is taking in information from the environment and then generating an appropriate response in the organism to that stimulus in the environment. And diversity we see in birds is also reflected in their brains. So on this slide, we have a lot of different types of birds, and these little blue marble things are models of their brains, or the space their brains sat in, that were generated in my advisor's lab. And so my dissertation focuses on understanding what makes those brains look different if it is tied to behavior. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. First, we need to understand more about bird brains. So traditionally, we thought that birds weren't very intelligent because we thought that the majority of their brains were dedicated to kind of instinctive responses, as you can see in this purple, which doesn't require a lot of higher order processing of information. But work led by Dr. Eric Jarvis has shown that actually a large part of the brains of birds is devoted to this higher order information processing, just as it is in the brains of mammals. And even more interestingly, bird and mammal brains are organized very differently. So that means that there were two different evolutionary pathways to a similar level of brain function. Now, one of the classic examples of a dumb bird is the dodo. This was a bird that was on the island of Mauritius and doing just fine, and then humans came along and they went extinct. And so people thought that they couldn't possibly be very smart if they died that quickly. But research that came out recently led by Dr. Eugenia Gold, she and her colleagues found that looking at the size and the shape of the brain in dodos compared to their modern day relatives, they were probably just as smart as their modern day relatives, like, for example, pigeons, which may not seem like I'm saying very much because we don't tend to like pigeons very much, but if you think about it, pigeons have actually found a way to thrive in an environment that was not originally theirs, and alongside probably the most dangerous species in the world. So pigeons are actually probably doing pretty okay. There are some groups of birds, though, that are smarter than others. So, for example, parrots. This parrot was named Alex. He was an African gray that a researcher worked with, and the researcher was able to teach him over 100 words during his lifetime. And he didn't just recognize them or didn't just repeat them, he could actually recognize them and understood their meaning. And parrots and other birds like songbirds actually learn their songs in the same way that humans learn languages. Other birds have really long-term memory, like this Clark's nutcracker here. They can store thousands of seeds in preparation for the winter, and then in the coming months, remember the locations of most of them. Probably the most famous example in the news recently has been the intelligence of crows. So, for example, this New Caledonian crow, scientists have seen it selecting twigs and altering them by removing leaves to make them better tools so they can access food that they might not be able to get to otherwise, like this grub here. But as cool as modern day birds are, the only way to really understand them or any other modern day organism is to understand how they evolved, and the best way to do that is to look at the fossil record. So fossils are preserved evidence of life in deep time, and let's say we accept the kind of arbitrary definition of that being older than 10,000 years. So if we don't look at the fossil record of birds and just look at the modern day birds, that means we're missing about 145.5 million years of evolutionary information about why birds are the way they are today. And if we don't even look at the dinosaur fossils, then we're missing even more millions of years of information about the evolution of birds. But when it comes to studying past life, we can't actually study it the way we can study modern day species. We can't watch these extinct organisms interacting. What we get preserved is usually just the hard tissues, so the skeleton in fossils. But the skeleton can tell us some things about the biology of the organism, such as their anatomy. It can tell us about maybe the diet of the organism or the size or even some of the locomotory capabilities, so how it might have moved. But the only reason we can tell anything about the biology of an organism from its skeleton is because we understand how that skeleton interacts with the environment and how structure and function are linked in the modern day relatives that we can study directly. And bones and fossils can also, or fossilized bones can also preserve things that were inside the bone, spaces, for example, that might have held the brain. And so when we have a space that held the brain, and if it's well preserved, then we can make a 3D model of what the brain would have looked like, called a brain endocast. And you can see one here in the head of a worm-eating warbler. And in birds, that brain endocast is actually a very good representation of what the outside of the brain looked like in birds. So it is not the brain. The brain in most animals decomposes very quickly after the animal dies, and so the chances of that getting fossilized are slim to none. But if the bones stay preserved, then you can make this model of the brain and start to look at the external anatomy, the external shape of the brain. But this one was generated with some computer methods that I'm going to talk about in a second. Traditionally, we didn't always have computers to study these, so they had to be made with specimens that were cut open or naturally broken open. It's not always popular with museum curators who are assigned to protect specimens. They don't always want you cutting things open, and so we couldn't always study a lot of them. But in order to show you guys how we used to make them, I'm going to ask for a volunteer to come up and make an endocast with Play-Doh, and James is going to help whoever volunteers to do it. So, who wants to play with Play-Doh? All right, over here. All right, do you guys want to? Yeah. All right, so while they work on making our physical endocasts, I'm going to talk about how we make them right now. So what scientists do is use a CT scanner, which is a special type of X-ray scanner, and we can scan a specimen and scan it in 3 dimensions so that we can get information about the inside, what was inside the specimen, and recreate 3-dimensional models. And so then we can get these data, which for this example are one of those human-caused extinctions, the MOA I talked about earlier. And you can see we have it in 3 dimensions, and using that we can make a 3D model. And while they keep working on that, I'm also going to review some endocast anatomy. So remember that the endocast is not the brain. However, in birds, it does show the external part of the brain very well. So these labels correspond to the same brain structure. So for example, this is a very large pigeon endocast, and you're looking at it in profile this way. And so you have the cerebrum, and that's what does most of what we would think of as the thinking. That's the processing information part of the brain. You have the cerebellum back here, which is involved in coordinating motor movement, so coordinating motion in the animal. You have the optic lobe down here, which is receiving information from the eyeballs and then passing that up to the cerebrum so that information can be processed. And then you have the olfactory bulb right up here, which is the part of the brain that's devoted to processing that sense of smell. So let's check in with our volunteers.
No.
Do we have one?
We have one.
Wow, okay, great. So we got some stuck. All right, so what we're going to do is have our volunteer and James, whoever wants to, kind of walk this around to the front of the room, and then they're going to pass these around. Be careful because our endocast is still very squishy because it's Play-Doh.
It's super squishy.
And we can actually pass another one around that I made in preparation. So you guys can look at and see some of the same structures that I just pointed out on these virtual endocasts on a physical endocast.
Oh, for the camera, okay. Yes. I don't know if you can see these on the camera anyway, but I'll come closer to there. Okay, there we go.
So before I go on, I want to take a pause and see if there are any questions so far. Oh, okay, we got one down here.
One of the slides, it had birds with the beaks overlapping
Beaks. Oh, so the question was back to the slide with the feeding that we were talking about, I think. Right here. So you're wondering about the crossbill here. So if I remember correctly, they are actually using that to kind of open things up and extract things, for, like if we were talking about like pine nuts, for example, in a pine cone. They can use that to get into tight spaces. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Oh, yes, I did. Accounting for the greater intelligence of corvids and parrots, what morphological differences in the brain led to that? Like how it does, there was an emphasis on cerebral cortex development in our evolution.
Okay, so the question was regarding intelligence in things like parrots or crows, if there was any difference in the shape of their brains compared to other birds that might not be as intelligent in terms of which parts of the brain they emphasize and how they're processing that information. And yeah, they actually do have the part of their brains called, I guess I'll go back to that slide, called the cerebrum, so the part that is in processing that information is expanded in those guys, but not necessarily to the same, like we can't just look at an endocast and say like, oh, that part is bigger, so it's definitely this, because there's also other factors that play a role in how an endocast looks. There's things like just what type of bird it is, so the relatedness. All crow endocasts are probably going to look more similar to each other than they will to other birds. All right, so I think as that physical endocast goes around, I'm going to keep going, then take some more questions in a little bit. And so by using this CT scanning method, we can generate a lot of endocasts of a lot of different birds. So this sample is what I and my collaborators have worked up for my dissertation so far, and we can start to see some big shape differences between, say, the one on the bottom here of a bobwhite quail and up at the top there of a great horned owl. And all of these endocasts are as if you're looking directly down at the top of the bird's head. But I'm not the only person to work on this. There's actually quite a history of people looking at the endocasts of modern day and extinct animals and trying to correlate the differences that we see in endocast shape with behavior. So for example, Dr. Ashley Morhart, who actually did her dissertation here in my advisor's lab and recently finished, for her project, she looked at the endocasts of non-avian dinosaurs. But non-avian dinosaurs are kind of tricky because their endocasts don't actually look a whole lot like their brains. There's a lot of other soft tissues taking up that space and preventing the brain from impressing on the bone like it does in birds. And so she and her collaborators here worked out this system looking at the soft tissues around the brain in the modern day relatives, so things like birds and crocodilians, to come up with a systematic way to reconstruct models of the brain in non-avian dinosaurs like here. So that's one endocast project that's taking it even further back than my own project does. Work led by Dr. Amy Balanoff looked at the endocasts of other theropod dinosaurs and looked at the rate and the timing of evolution of the brain and the expansion of the brain. And their work actually suggests that a brain that was capable of handling the complex behavior of flight evolved before flight did in the avian lineage. And there have also been a lot of studies looking at an array of endocasts in modern day and extinct birds, and so staying in birds and not getting back into non-avian theropods, including my own work here in my advisor's lab on the endocast of the extinct moa. So this is a giant flightless bird from New Zealand, which is now extinct, and my collaborators here in my advisor's lab and I have worked together to build a sample of endocasts of their modern day relatives to compare the brain anatomy for this extinct bird and their modern day relatives. But the problem with making inferences about behavior from endocasts is that endocasts are not brains. And the things that we know about brains and behavior are based on the internal structures in brains that you can see outlined here and here. So the size of internal brain structures has been correlated with behavior, but behavior hasn't been correlated with those external endocast structures. And so in order to make inferences about behavior, when we don't have a brain, if we want to use an endocast, we first need to make sure that the endocast accurately represents the brain structure underneath. And so in order to do this, we can look at the volumes of brain structures. So for example, we have the hyperpaleum over here. Researchers have taken these stained brain sections, so they take a brain and they cut it up into a series of sections, and then they can look at it under a microscope and measure the volume of the hyperpaleum. And the hyperpaleum is a structure that is in the cerebrum, so again, that processing part of the brain, and it receives visual information and processes that. It also processes some somatosensory information, which means information about touch all over the body of the bird, and it also gives rise to a motor pathway, so part of the pathways that are involved in motion in the bird. And it's overlain by this endocast structure called the Wulst. So the Wulst is just a German word, and it has been classically applied to this structure on the endocast. Excuse me. And by looking at the surface area of the Wulst, we can compare it to the volume of the hyperpaleum to see if that Wulst, the endocast structure, is a fair predictor of the size of the brain structure. And we can do the same thing in this other brain structure called the optic tectum up here. So this is that structure that I was talking about, receives visual information, so the eyeballs basically feed the information that they're receiving about the visual world around it into this structure, and then it feeds up to the cerebrum in a different visual pathway. And the structure that overlies that is the optic lobe. And so again, by looking at the surface area of the optic lobe, which we can measure from these virtual models of the endocast, and comparing it to the volume, we can see if these structures are accurately representing the size of that underlying brain structure. Which you can see on this graph here. So on the x-axis, we have the surface area that we've measured from this optic lobe. On the y-axis, we have the volume of the optic tectum. And the line here is actually doing a pretty good job of predicting volume from surface area. And so these are just preliminary results. We'll still be collecting more data, but so far it's suggesting that the surface area of an endocast structure does do a good job of predicting the volume of a brain structure. And so we can use that, and we can use that equation to predict the volume of the brain structure in extinct birds, like the moa here that I was just talking about. And in this slide, front is this way. We're again looking at it from the side. And if we compare it, to example, to its modern-day relatives, you can see that the optic lobe on the moa seems really small compared to everyone else. And so by using that equation that we generate from looking at a lot of modern-day species, we can predict the underlying structure of or underlying volume of the brain structure, and look and really start to get at whether or not that reduction in the endocast structure had any behavioral significance for this animal. And then as we build that sample size, as we build the strength of that regression, and we can start to see more patterns that, that might have to do with behavior in terms of endocast morphology. So for example, you can see, like I was saying earlier, the relationships might influence it. These two look a lot more like each other than they might to this one, for example. And so as we grow the sample, we'll be able to hopefully get at these questions, sort of the one you asked about, if there is a relationship between a certain behavior and the size of a certain endocast structure. So to sum it up, we've gone over avian evolution, where birds came from, why they're so great. We've talked a little bit about bird brains and what that means for behavior and what we understand now about it that we didn't before. Excuse me, sorry. And then we've also talked a little bit about my own research into the evolution of avian brains, what we can understand from the fossil record, and how studying the fossil record can teach us about modern-day animals, and how studying modern-day animals can also teach us about their extinct relatives. And so with that, I would like to thank all of the people that made this possible today, my advisor, Dr. Larry Whitmer, all of the members of the Whitmer Lab, some of whom could be here today to help, and some of whom have graduated and gotten out, but still provided very valuable mentorship to me. The Biological Sciences Department and the students and faculty there that all contribute to such a great learning environment for all of the graduate students in it. My funding sources, the National Science Foundation, Graduate Student Senate here, the Office of the Vice President for Research and Creative Activity. They awarded me a Student Enhancement Award that has helped a lot with the data collection for this project, and I think they have a deadline coming up pretty early next semester, so if any graduate students are here looking for funding, that's a really great avenue to pursue. And the American Museum of Natural History Frank Chapman Fund also funded part of this research. And I would like to thank the organizers of the cafe series for inviting me here today to do a science cafe. And so with that, I will take any questions. We'll do a question session, and afterwards I wanted to end a little early so you guys could come up and see all the cool specimens we brought. So we'll do that after we get some questions out of the way. I think there was one in the back that I didn't get to earlier.
Anybody?
Any questions? Oh, okay. What was the smartest dinosaur? Well, yeah. I mean, I could be tricky and say the smartest dinosaur is a crow, but I don't think we have a strong answer on that yet. So there are certainly some dinosaurs that had larger brains, and it seems like the ones that are on that theropod lineage leading up to birds did have larger brains, and that's more of the work done by Ashley Morehart while she was here. But again, the idea of intelligence and how smart things are is also a little tricky, because there would be some that would be really good at doing some things and not so good at doing other things. And I think we as humans tend to undervalue that because we have one definition of what is intelligent. So we don't know is the short answer to your question. Yes.
Curious about your one passing reference to a development in the brain having to do with the avian capabilities of the animal, which seem to predate the actual ability to fly.
Mm-hmm.
That seems a little backward to me, where I'm kind of, why would such a brain development occur if the animal had no capability?
Okay, so this is getting back to, this is a question about the work done by Amy Balanoff and her collaborators about, the question is, why would a flight-ready brain have evolved before flight? And I think their answer for you would be that the expansion that you see in the brain in that lineage actually wasn't originally for flight. They were just undergoing an expansion in the brain, and then it happened to allow them to fly. So instead of, I think we tend to think of things always in the term of an adaptation, like it's always for this purpose. But a lot of times, actually, you have structures that maybe happened. They weren't there for a purpose, and then get used for a purpose later on in evolution. So I think that's the answer they're going to maybe go for.
Red shirt, blue jacket.
Okay. Why was the moa flightless? Well, that's a great question. Again, this gets to sometimes there isn't a reason, but for the moa, it seems like there's a pretty good reason. So they evolved on New Zealand, which is an island. And at the time that they evolved, there were no predators around except for another really big bird called a Haas eagle that could fly. But there weren't any mammal predators. And so they didn't need to be flying away from any predators on the ground. And they also developed what we call island gigantism, which is sometimes species that end up on islands and evolve on islands can get really, really big. And so there's not really a why, but that's how they got to not fly. And they actually, if you look at their skeletons, they barely even have bones for wings anymore. So it's pretty cool. And actually, they have little sticks for wings. And we have this model of a moa skull here that was just 3D printed at the Innovation Center here at Ohio University. And so this is how big the skull was. If that's how big the skull was, and the rest of the body was going to be up here. I don't even know if I can reach high enough to the height of the moa. That's not going to be able to fly very well. Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Yes. Yeah. Oh, the flocculus is part of the cerebellum, and that's also coordinating information. But that has a lot to do with taking information from the semicircular canals, which are a structure that kind of help us sense where our head and our body is in space. So it has to do with balance and kind of keeping the head straight while the body is moving. So as birds are flying around, obviously their body's moving all around, but if their head, which is where the information from their environment is coming in, is moving around, they're not going to be able to see well, they're not going to be able to process it very well. So it has to do with integrating all of those sources of information and keeping the head and neck stable is one of the functions of it. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Obviously, that's not the actual structure of the brain, but what are other things that were maybe not part of the brain? Like, what kind of tissues are those? Is that like muscle, like sinuses?
Okay, yeah. So the question is, when we were looking at the endocast of a non-avian dinosaur, and the one actually up there was this endocast of T-Rex. So here's the skull of T-Rex for a size comparison. And so the question is, what are the other structures around the brain, since the endocast in non-avian dinosaurs is not a good representation of the brain. And you mentioned sinuses. So there are a lot of what we call venous sinuses, so blood vessels around the brain that are supplying blood to the brain and also draining it away. And a lot of what we would call like meningeal tissues, so just the tissues that surround the brain. And we have them too. They're just in human brains, they're quite close to the brain.
So, I mean, sorry, just to
It's okay.
continue a little bit. In the other top-down picture you showed of different birds, they had odd structure coming out. How do you figure out what is meningeal or sinus and what is actual brain?
Okay. And so the follow-up question is, when you're looking at the endocast of birds, like we have this endocast of a fulmar here that's been blown up 5 times. If you're looking at the structures, how do you know which parts of these are brain structure, and how do you know what might be blood vessel or sinus or meningeal tissues? The answer is, in part, we do dissections to confirm that what we're seeing here is actual neural or brain tissue and not other structures. There's also, I mean, if you look at this structure, and actually I can pass this around. If you look at this, you can kind of see the folds on the brain, or on the endocast, that we could actually see on the brain. So that's pretty good evidence there's nothing between the brain and the skull. There are some parts, like actually the flocculus that he asked about, that it is hard to tell the boundary between the brain tissue and the blood supply to it. And so for those, you have to do some staining, maybe MRI scanning or dissection to confirm. And so I'm going to pass this around. This is the endocast of a seabird, but it's been blown up 5 times. It's not actually this big. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, one in the back.
Yeah.
Do you know why the bird flies with 8 extinction and all the dinosaurs?
Okay, so the question is, why did birds make it through, some birds make it through the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, and 75% of Earth's species didn't? We actually don't know yet why certain species made it through and certain species don't. It might have to do with size, but I don't think scientists have come to a consensus on why whoever made it through actually made it through that extinction. Yes? Do I have a favorite dinosaur brain and why? Well, I kind of like this guy down here. So I guess the lights are up now. This is a kiwi, and if you guys don't know what the kiwi is, yeah, you guys know what kiwi is? Yeah. So kiwi are another bird that evolved in New Zealand, and they are still around, although they are endangered. And they're really weird. They actually... Here, I've got another slide. Could we get the lights down a little bit at the front? So kiwis are nocturnal, And so they are eating at night, so they don't have really big eyes. You almost like can barely see their eyes, actually. And they're using olfaction, so the sense of smell, to locate their prey, as well as touch with the tips of their bills. So you can see this guy is doing a really good job of finding food, even though it looks like he's not, because his bill is buried all the way in the dirt, so he can sense his prey that way. And so the reason I like the endocast is because it's very different from anyone else here, because kiwi are very different from pretty much any other birds we have around. And it has, like, you can barely see the volst. It's back here, and on this you probably can't even see it. So I don't know, it's just a funny looking endocast, but it seems like it looks funny because it has all these specializations. And so as I get more into these trends, I'll hopefully be able to tell if there is any sensory correlation with the way the kiwi endocast looks compared to everyone else.
Okay, shall we open the floor to,
I think we should probably open the floor and let you guys come up and see these cool
one
things.
announcement. Next week, math, zombies, and the text of the universe. Be here. Should be kind of interesting.
And there is also, we have helpers, I forgot to mention, in these shirts. They're going to be around, and they will also be available to answer your questions about these specimens. So if I'm busy, find one of them. They also know a lot of stuff.
The white shirt with the dinosaurs. There's cast up there, some in here, and of course, all of these.
Yeah, so please come on up to the stage, check things out.